So thank you very much, dear participants, to the conference. It is a great honor to start this conference today. One, because it is International Day of Science, and that's what makes the entire thing is even more challenging. And second, it is not the first, it's already a second time that I have participated in this conference. And this plenary report is not exactly the sign of its great importance, and it's not the sign of a great contribution from me as one of the co-authors. You see the three co-authors here, and Dr. Yuri Melnik is the first one, and Irina Pipenko is the other one. And I am just the presenter of the information that has been collected and that has been analyzed since the conference that took place last June. During that conference, there was an interesting event, which was a roundtable discussion. And the participants of that roundtable discussion kindly offered their the participation in a survey, and that survey was dealing with the impact of social distancing measures on higher education stakeholders, who are by definition teachers and students. The results of that survey were quite impressive. And that's why we decided actually to give a kind of a coverage of what we have collected. It is not big news today that the COVID pandemic is a global crisis. It is a calamity of unprecedented proportions. And obviously, as more and more research papers appear dealing with the various aspects of the impact of this pandemic on various spheres of social life, it is even more understandable that the impact on education is very, very serious. And obviously, this very situation that we are living through today is going to be the object of research for scholars across multiple disciplines for years and years to come. And many authors have already said so in their publications. We, as the authors, also tried to contribute to this. And the aim of our research was to monitor the attitudes, the newly forming attitudes of international educators in terms of the preparedness for the pandemic-affected educational practices. To do this, we prepared a questionnaire of 5 different questions, and this questionnaire was administered to the participants of the previous conference. The key term in this research is emergency remote teaching. It is not exactly what distance learning or e-learning or mobile learning or U-learning, that is ubiquitous learning, are. It is something that appeared sometime like last spring, and it was a kind of a quick response, quick reaction to the pandemic and the situation that it produced in education. That's why we are going to use this term, emergency remote teaching practices, as sort of opposed to distance learning, because this obviously is something novel, something that has never been before. As far as methods and materials of this research, well, it was basically action research, because as I have already said, we engaged the participants of the roundtable discussion into responding to the questionnaire questions, and they kindly agreed. And doing so, we actually followed all the necessary procedures that are required of such research. The research protocol was obviously approved by the Institutional Research Ethics Committee, and the procedure complies with the standards of research involving human subject. It's the well-known 1964 Helsinki Declaration and its subsequent amendments. And this, by the way, is the screenshot of the roundtable discussion online from the previous conference. You can see some familiar faces here, and it's great that we have some sort of continuity in our research. And let's talk a little bit about the questions themselves. As some of the members of the audience of today may remember, so there were 5 questions, and you can see these questions, the wording of those questions on the slide here. The first question dealt with the level of readiness of educational establishments as estimated by the teachers. And the second question was dealing with the teacher's own level of preparedness for the implementation of teaching in conditions of the pandemic. And question 3 was dealing with, or is dealing with, the results of teaching and learning in conditions of the global pandemic. And the teachers were supposed to evaluate in some way the educational outcomes. And the fourth question dealt more with the aspects of physical and mental health. And the exact question sounded like this. What is the effect of social distancing caused by the COVID-19 pandemic on your physical and mental health? Question 5 was less structured than the first 4. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. But question 5 was an open-ended question, and the participants of the survey simply gave extended written responses to this question. The question was, what did you find the most important or valuable in conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic? As far as the first 4 questions, the researchers used a Likert type scale. And so the answers were all valued according to the following scale. The scale was like +2, very positive or very high, +1, 0, like I'm undecided or neutral, and -1 and -2, like negative or low, or very negative or very low. And as I have already said, question 5 was a semi-structured interview. All in all, about 235 reports were received, and 216 qualified for the purposes of the study. This table here, it gives the overall picture of the responses. As you can see here, a lot of mathematical statistics was used, and it was actually the contribution made by one of the authors, whose name is Irina Pipenko, and she did a hell of a lot of work doing all these statistics. And the Pearson method, square X, obviously was used, using some packages from Microsoft to do statistical evaluations. And here on this very table, lots of figures, obviously, but one can see the dynamics of the responses to questions 1 through 4. And even a quick glance at this table suggests the idea that the first 3 questions were mostly evaluated in a more positive light. As far as question 4, it dealt with the impact of the COVID pandemic on physical and mental health. Well, here we can see a reverse picture. Here we can see that the evaluations were mostly negative. And this gives us the verbalized results of this research. Like 81% of respondents, according to the estimations, were well prepared as individuals to conduct emergency remote teaching during the lockdown. Well, but basically it is no surprise, of course, because teachers are always teachers in times of the pandemic or at any other time. 68.5% of respondents were satisfied with the educational outcomes of emergency remote teaching practices, which mostly took place during March, April, May, and June 2020. And about the same number, 62.9% of respondents evaluated highly the level of their institution's preparedness for emergency remote teaching. Well, it's great because it means the educational systems seemed to be well prepared for any such crisis situations. And as far as the mathematics goes, here down there, you can see the description. And this means that the null hypothesis stating the absence of differences has been confirmed. And that means the researchers have received statistically significant data. So in simple terms, one can trust these percentages. There is an interesting aspect of this research which deals with the gender differences in responses. The responses obtained from female respondents and male respondents vary in some way, but not much. And one can see that basically both female and male respondents evaluated the impact in a sort of a similar way. Great differences have not been observed. Well, there is an interesting find as far as question 4 goes. The results show that only 37% of respondents evaluated positively the effect of social distancing measures on physical and mental health. And that means that the situation in education really hit us all in some important ways. And that's why whatever one may say about the level of preparedness and things like that, still, it was a difficult situation and it required extra effort on the part of both teachers and students. And speaking of teachers and students, it's actually the later part of our research. But as far as the first phase, well, we asked ourselves a question. Is this pandemic really a kind of a factor revolutionizing the system of education? And our suggestions are such. Well, looks like it is not exactly going to be a revolution in education, because the educators themselves are more or less prepared for any such crisis situation. That's why there is no need for any major revolutionary change. And if this revolution or evolution really takes place, it is actually related to the problem of institutional preparedness for emergencies like this, which perhaps are more to follow in the future. Let's hope it's not going to happen soon. And as far as the changes, the major changes, the more dramatic changes, well, these may be taking place in the system of professional values of educators. And such a conclusion can be suggested by the open questions or answers to the open question number 5 that we received during the survey. And the only practical result of all this crisis situation is this. International educators reported better opportunities for professional development and autodidacticism, for research work and international contacts. And basically, this very research and the roundtable discussion that took place at the previous conference are just testimony to all this. Coming back to the second stage of our research, which was conducted not so long ago. This was already the research that involved students. And we covered the responses given by 594 stakeholders of education, among them 216 faculty members and 378 university students. They all participated in the survey during the lockdown. And the overall picture is presented on this slide, this very table. As you can see, lots of figures, and basically the trends are sort of similar to the trends that we have observed earlier. But speaking of the impact on stakeholders, well, it is only the first question where we haven't observed any marked differences, because both students and teachers answered the first question, like the level of individual preparedness for doing things during lockdown, well, as positively. And speaking about the other questions 2, 3, and 4, the researchers have observed marked differences here. And though both categories of stakeholders, teachers and students alike, seem to be prepared well for the educational emergency, the students, surprisingly or unsurprisingly perhaps, seem to be more satisfied with the educational outcomes. Once again, it actually is a sign of the simple fact that teachers are never fully satisfied with the results. And one can also draw a conclusion that it is not the faculty, but the student body that is affected more negatively by the social distancing measures. Teachers were sort of more prepared to face all those challenges, but the students, judging from their answers, were prepared less. And finishing this, the present research, both the first and the second stage, obviously seem to be limited in scope. But anyway, it is the direct result of the plethora of communication opportunities that were presented by the lockdown